Hey guys, tonight we begin with the crushing, soot-streaked misery of the 19th century coal miner. The forgotten backbone of the Industrial Revolution who brought us smuggy skylines, child labour laws, eventually, and the fine art of coughing up black dust while trying not to be crushed by a falling ceiling. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you think you'd survive a day down in the mines? Adorable. Honestly, like sending a kitten down a mineshaft with a lunch pail and a pickaxe. So you think being a coal miner in the 19th century was just a job? Think again. It was a one-way ticket to a world where the sun was a rumour, your lungs were a science experiment, and death clocked in for work every single day. Welcome to the pit, friend. Hope you brought your coffin measurements, because you're going to need them. Before you could even dream of coughing up black spit for the rest of your shortened life, you had to make it through the hiring process. The coal company's version of a job interview, except the only qualification they cared about was, does this man look like he can crawl through a space smaller than a coffin while hauling half his body weight in coal? Step 1. Present yourself to the foreman. Hat off, desperation on full display. Hopes buried deeper than the coal you'd soon be digging. The foreman had seen 1,000 desperate faces and wasn't impressed by yours. He checked your hands, not to admire your craftsmanship, but to make sure they weren't too soft to grip a pickaxe for 12 hours straight. Weak constitution. Rejected. Fear of enclosed spaces. Rejected. Visible intelligence that might lead to union organizing. Definitely rejected. Size mattered, but not the way you think. Too big, and you couldn't fit through the narrow tunnels. Too small, and you couldn't move the coal cars. Just right meant you were the perfect size to be slowly crushed by circumstance. If you made it past inspection, you were now considered suitable, which in mining terms meant unlikely to immediately collapse and block a tunnel. And yes, you had to accept the terms, not negotiated terms, but whatever the company decided you were worth, which was usually about as much as a good mule, and sometimes less. This contract was taken very seriously by them, not so much by you since you probably couldn't read it. If you caused trouble, you weren't fired. You were blacklisted, evicted from company housing, and left to starve with a reputation that followed you to every mine in the county. Still interested? Excellent. Now surrender your surface, dwelling identity. Trade your clean lungs for a company number, and prepare for the next, however, many years you survive of back-breaking labour, cave-ins, and being treated like a piece of equipment that occasionally needed feeding. They called this honest work. Men lined up for it, because the alternative was starvation. Some were even grateful. Steady pay, they said. Better than the workhouse, they said. Most of them were dead within a decade, and don't think being experienced made it easier. In fact, it made you more valuable to risk in the deepest, most dangerous shafts. If you were the wrong combination of desperate and healthy, congratulations. The mine was your future, your present, and quite possibly your tomb. Of course, if you were an immigrant, you could still get hired. They just paid you even less, gave you the worst shifts, and used you as a human canary to test for gas leaks. And that was just getting the job. So you made it past hiring, you're in. Congratulations. Now the real nightmare begins your first day underground. Forget everything you thought you knew about work. Forget sunlight. Forget fresh air. Forget the concept of break time, or reasonable hours, or basic human dignity. You are now a coal miner, which in practical terms means you're a mole with opposable thumbs and a death wish. Your new identity was wrapped in canvas overalls, a flickering oil lamp, and the growing certainty that you'd made a terrible mistake. Your workspace wasn't an office or a shop floor. It was a hole in the ground that seemed designed by someone who really hated human beings. Everyone looked the same down there, covered in coal dust, squinting in the dim light, moving with the careful desperation of people who knew that one wrong step could bring several tons of rock down on their heads. You want some job security? Great. Your security was knowing that as long as the coal lasted, they'd keep sending you down into that hole. The mine didn't care about your feelings, your fears, or your increasingly frequent nightmares about being buried alive. It was a machine that ate men and spat out coal, and you were now part of the feeding mechanism. Your new best friends were whoever happened to be working your section. Men whose names you might never learn, because the dust made everyone look the same, and the noise made conversation nearly impossible. Individuality was pointless down there. Uniqueness was dangerous. If you thought too much about how insane this all was, you might start asking questions, and questions led to accidents. Or at least, that's what the foreman would say at the inquest. You worked in a space barely tall enough to crouch in, surrounded by walls of coal and rock that creaked ominously with every swing of your pickaxe. If the mountain shifted, you all felt it. If the air went bad, you all breathed poison together. If a tunnel collapsed, well, you all became statistics together. Oh. And about that equipment you were issued, it wasn't a gift. Every pickaxe, every lamp, every tool came out of your pay. The company store made sure you owed them money before you even started working. It was like a subscription service, except instead of streaming movies, you got the privilege of slowly killing yourself for someone else's profit. Your first day underground was like being born in reverse. Instead of emerging into light and air, you descended into darkness and suffocation. The cage that lowered you into the pit wasn't built for comfort. It was a metal box designed to transport human cargo as efficiently as possible, which meant cramming as many bodies as physics would allow into a space that would make a coffin feel spacious. The descent was a journey into hell, literally. As the cage dropped, the temperature rose. The walls of the shaft passed by in a blur of rock and timber, and with each foot deeper, the weight of the earth above you became more real, more crushing. By the time you reached the bottom, sometimes hundreds of feet below the surface, you understood that you were now in a different world, one governed by different rules, where the normal concepts of safety and sanity had been checked at the surface. The main tunnel stretched out before you like the throat of some enormous beast. Gas lamps flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows that made everything look alive and threatening. The air was thick with coal dust and the smell of human sweat, lamp oil, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that you'd learn was the scent of fear mixed with inadequate ventilation. Your section foreman, a man whose face had been permanently rearranged by coal dust and whose cough sounded like gravel in a tin can, would point you toward your work area. "That's your heading," he'd say, indicating a tunnel that looked like it had been dug by someone with a profound misunderstanding of structural engineering. Coal face is about 200 yards that way. Mind the props, some of them are newer than others. The props, you'd learn, were the wooden beams holding up the ceiling. Some were solid oak, installed by men who cared about staying alive. Others were whatever scrap wood the company could get cheap, installed by men who were paid by the linear foot and didn't much care if their work lasted beyond next Tuesday. Your job was to figure out which was which, preferably before several tons of rock decided to test your judgment. The walk to your work area was an education in the creative ways the earth could try to kill you. Low, hanging beams that would knock you unconscious if you forgot to duck. Pools of stagnant water that could hide anything from a twisted ankle to the entrance to a deeper shaft. Rails for the coal cars that were placed with the sort of precision you'd expect from a drunken surveyor. And everywhere, the constant drip, drip, drip of water seeping through the rock, a sound that would follow you into your dreams and make you wonder if the entire mountain was slowly dissolving above your head. Your actual workplace was a coal face, a wall of black gold that you were expected to attack with hand tools like a medieval warrior storming a particularly flammable castle. The space was cramped, usually no more than 3 or 4 feet high, which meant you'd be spending your day crouched like a penitent or crawling like an infant, swinging a pickaxe at a wall that fought back by dropping chunks of coal and rock on your head. The technique was simple in theory: hack away at the coal, load it into cars, and push those cars back to the main tunnel where a mule or a small locomotive would haul them to the surface. In practice, it was like trying to demolish a building with a spoon while wearing a blindfold and holding your breath. Your lamp provided just enough light to see the immediate area around you, which meant you were always working at the edge of darkness. The coal face itself was a puzzle of hard and soft spots, veins of coal mixed with rock, and sometimes pockets of gas that could turn your workplace into a bomb with one spark from your lamp. Every swing of the pickaxe was a small gamble with physics and chemistry, a bet that this particular impact wouldn't be the one that brought the ceiling down or ignited something that would turn you into a cautionary tale. The coal didn't come out in neat, manageable pieces. Sometimes you'd hit a soft spot and half the face would collapse, burying you up to your waist in coal and rock. Other times you'd hit a section as hard as iron, and your pickaxe would ring off it like a bell while the shock travelled up your arms and reminded every joint in your body that this wasn't what humans were designed to do. Loading the coal was its own special form of torture. The cars were built low and wide, designed for efficiency rather than ergonomics. Loading them meant shoveling coal while crouched in a space where you couldn't stand up straight, then pushing a car that weighed more than a horse through tunnels that were barely wider than the car itself. It was like playing a very dangerous, very dirty version of chess, where every move had to be calculated to avoid getting crushed, buried, or simply lost in the maze of tunnels that made up the mine. And then there was the pushing. Coal cars didn't have engines. They had you. Hundreds of pounds of coal in an iron cart, and your job was to get it from the coal face to the main tunnel using nothing but your back, your legs, and whatever remained of your will to live. The rails were uneven. The tunnels were curved, and the cars had a tendency to derail at the worst possible moments. Usually when you were pushing them through a section where a derailment meant being trapped between a runaway cart and a wall of solid rock. By the end of your first day, you understood that everything about this job was designed to break you down, physically and mentally. Your back ached from the constant crouching. Your arms felt like they'd been beaten with hammers. Your lungs burned from breathing air that was more coal dust than oxygen. And you'd only worked one shift. You had the rest of your life to look forward to this, assuming your life lasted long enough to matter. Your typical workday started before dawn, not because that's when the work began, but because it took an hour just to get ready and travel to your workplace. The company housing, if you were lucky enough to get it, was built as close to the mine as possible, while still maintaining the pretense of being a place where humans could live. The houses were identical wooden boxes, lined up in neat rows like a cemetery for the living, each one containing a family whose breadwinner spent his days underground and his nights coughing up black flame. Getting dressed for work was like suiting up for battle, if battles were fought in sewers. Your work clothes were canvas overalls that had been designed by someone who'd never actually tried to move in them. Thick, stiff, and about as flexible as a suit of armor, they were built to last, which was good because you'd be wearing the same pair until they literally fell apart. Underneath, you wore whatever you could afford, which usually meant cotton shirts that would be soaked through with sweat within an hour of starting work. Your boots were the most important piece of equipment you owned, and also the most expensive. Good boots meant the difference between having feet at the end of the day and having raw, bleeding stumps that couldn't carry you home. The company store sold boots, of course, at prices that ensured you'd be paying for them for months. But the alternative was working barefoot, or in shoes that would disintegrate the first time they touched anything harder than grass. The oil lamp was your lifeline, your lighthouse, your only connection to the possibility of seeing what was about to kill you. It was also a fire hazard, a source of toxic fumes, and about as reliable as a politician's promise. The lamp burned whale oil or kerosene, producing a flame that flickered with every breath of air and went out completely if you looked at it wrong. Keeping it lit was a constant battle against physics, and losing that battle meant working in complete darkness until you could fumble your way to someone else's light. The walk to the mine was a journey through a landscape that looked like the aftermath of a war between humans and nature, with nature losing badly. The area around the mine was stripped bare of vegetation, covered in coal dust, and dotted with the industrial equipment that kept the operation running. Steam engines chugged and wheezed, hauling cars full of coal to the surface. Smokestacks belched black clouds that turned the sky the color of old pewter. And everywhere, the sound of machinery, shouting, and the general cacophony of an industry that never slept. The mine entrance was a wound in the earth, surrounded by wooden structures that looked like they'd been built by someone who'd heard about construction, but never actually seen it done. The headframe, which housed the pulley system for the cage, towered over everything like a gallows, which was probably intentional. It was a reminder that this was where men went down and coal came up, and the ratio wasn't always 1-to-1. The cage itself was a marvel of engineering in the same way that a guillotine is a marvel of engineering. Efficient, brutal, and designed with a specific job in mind. It was an iron box, barely large enough for the men it carried, with gaps between the floorboards that let you see the shaft walls rushing past as you descended. Safety features were minimal and largely theoretical. The cage was attached to the surface by a steel cable that was inspected whenever someone remembered to do it, which wasn't nearly often enough for the peace of mind of the men whose lives depended on it. The descent was always the same, and always terrifying. 20, 30, sometimes 40 men crammed into a space designed for maybe half that number. The cage would lurch as it started its journey down, and for a moment you'd feel weightless, like you were falling. Then the cable would catch, and you'd drop at a speed that made your stomach try to relocate to your throat. The walls of the shaft were close enough to touch, close enough to see the water seeping through the rock, close enough to understand that you were descending into a place where the normal rules didn't apply. At the bottom, the cage would slam to a stop with a jolt that reminded everyone that mechanical systems in the 19th century were more about function than finesse. The gates would open, and you'd step out into your workplace for the next 12 hours, assuming nothing went wrong. And things went wrong a lot. The mine was a maze of tunnels, shafts, and chambers that had been carved out of the earth with about as much planning as a rabbit warren. Main tunnels led to smaller tunnels, which led to coal faces, which led to dead ends, which sometimes led to other mines, other levels, or simply to nowhere at all. Getting lost was a real possibility, and getting lost in a mine meant wandering in darkness until your lamp ran out of oil, and you became another mystery for the rescue teams to solve. Assuming they bothered to look, your work area was assigned by the foreman, a man whose job was to squeeze as much coal out of the earth as possible, while spending as little money as possible on the men doing the squeezing. Safety was expensive. Replacement miners were cheap. The math was simple, even if the morality was questionable. The actual work was a study in the creative ways that physics and chemistry could collaborate to make your life miserable. Coal isn't uniform. Some of it comes out easily, crumbling at the touch of a pickaxe. Some of it is harder than granite and has to be chipped away piece by piece over hours of back-breaking labor. Some of it is mixed with rock, which meant you'd spend half your time mining coal and the other half mining worthless stone that the company wouldn't pay you for. And then there were the gases. Mines were natural gas factories, producing a variety of invisible killers that made the air itself your enemy. Methane would build up in pockets and turn your workplace into a bomb waiting for a spark. Carbon monoxide would seep out of the coal and slowly poison you without you realizing it until you collapsed. Carbon dioxide was heavier than air and would settle in low places, creating pools of death that could kill you in minutes if you were unlucky enough to stumble into them. The company's solution to the gas problem was ventilation, which in theory meant moving fresh air through the mine to dilute the dangerous gases. In practice, it meant a series of fans, air shafts, and canvas barriers that worked about, as well as you'd expect from a system designed by people who never had to breathe the air they were managing. The ventilation might work perfectly in the main tunnels while leaving your work area filled with enough methane to level a city block. It might work great during the day shift and fail completely at night when fewer people were around to notice. It might work fine until it didn't, and then everyone would find out at the same time, usually in the form of an explosion that would be heard on the surface. Water was another constant enemy. The mine was essentially a hole in the ground, and water, following the basic principles of gravity, wanted to fill that hole. It seeped through the rock, pooled in low areas, and turned parts of the mine into underground rivers that had to be constantly pumped out to keep the work areas accessible. The pumps, like everything else in the mine, worked when they worked and didn't when they didn't. When they failed, entire sections of the mine would flood, trapping anyone unlucky enough to be working there when the water started rising. The flooding wasn't just an immediate danger, it was also a long-term problem. Standing water in a mine meant that sections became inaccessible, coal faces were abandoned, and the entire layout of the mine had to be adjusted. It also meant that when the water was finally pumped out, you'd be working in areas that had been underwater for weeks or months, breathing air that smelled like a swamp and working in mud that might hide anything from unstable ground to pockets of gas that had been trapped under the water. Your tools were simple but brutally effective at destroying your body. The pickaxe was your primary weapon against the coal face, a heavy iron blade attached to a wooden handle that transferred every impact directly to your arms, shoulders, and back. After a few hours of swinging a pickaxe in a crouched position, your entire upper body would feel like it had been used as a practice target by someone with a grudge against the human skeletal system. The shovel was equally punishing in its own way. Loading coal meant bending over, scooping up chunks of coal and rock, and tossing them into a cart that seemed designed to be exactly the wrong height for comfortable loading. Do this a few hundred times a day, every day, and your back would develop a permanent curve that matched the shape of your shovel handle. The coal car itself was a masterpiece of industrial sadism. Made of iron, built low to the ground, and loaded with hundreds of pounds of coal, it had to be pushed through tunnels that were barely wide enough for the car to pass through. The rails were uneven, the tunnels curved unpredictably, and the cars had a tendency to derail whenever you were pushing them through the narrowest, most dangerous sections of the mine. Derailments were a special kind of hell. The car would jump the rails, usually in a spot where you couldn't get around it, trapping you between hundreds of pounds of iron and coal, and whatever wall or ceiling happened to be in the way. Getting a derailed car back on the rails required lifting it, which meant finding enough men to help you and enough space for all of you to work, neither of which was guaranteed in the cramped confines of a mine tunnel. And if the car derailed in a tunnel that was prone to cave-ins, or in an area where gas tended to accumulate, or near a shaft where a mistake could send you and the car tumbling into the depths of the mine, well, that was just another day at the office. The coal had to move, the company had quotas to meet, and individual miners were replaceable in a way that coal cars, expensive as they were not. If working in the mine was hell, then the company store was purgatory, a place where your suffering was converted into profit with ruthless efficiency. The store wasn't just where you bought your necessities. It was the economic engine that kept you trapped in a cycle of debt that made indentured servitude look like a generous benefits package. The company store sold everything you needed to survive: food, clothing, tools, household supplies, medicine, and even entertainment in the form of alcohol that was marked up to prices that would make a highway robber blush. But here's the beautiful part of the system: you couldn't shop anywhere else. The nearest town might be 20 miles away over roads that were barely navigable by wagon. And even if you could get there, you probably didn't have the cash to pay for goods at market prices. You see, the company paid you in scrip, company money that was only good at the company store. It wasn't legal tender, couldn't be used anywhere else, and had an exchange rate with real money that fluctuated according to the company's needs rather than any actual economic principles. If you wanted real cash, you could exchange your scrip at a rate that would make a payday loan shark weep with envy, assuming the company was in a mood to make exchanges at all. The prices at the company's store were carefully calculated to ensure that you never quite earned enough to pay for what you needed. A loaf of bread that cost 5 cents in town would cost 15 cents at the company store. A pair of work boots that a cobbler might sell for $2 would cost $5 in scrip, payable over 6 months with interest that compounded daily. Medicine for your sick child, because children in mining towns were always sick, came at prices that ensured your family's health problems became your financial problems. The credit system was the real masterpiece of the operation. The company would advance you credit against your future wages, allowing you to buy necessities today that you'd pay for tomorrow, next week, next month, or possibly never. The interest rates were creative works of financial fiction, often exceeding 20% annually, and sometimes reaching rates that would make medieval usurers weep with admiration. Miss a payment, and the interest would compound. Get injured and miss work, and the debt would continue to grow while your income disappeared. The company kept meticulous records of every transaction, every payment, every outstanding balance. Your debt was tracked with a precision that rivaled their coal inventory, and like coal, debt was a commodity that could be bought, sold, and transferred. If you tried to leave for work at another mine, your debt would follow you. The mining companies had agreements with each other, a gentleman's understanding that a miner's debt was as portable as his mining experience. The store itself was usually a large wooden building near the mine entrance, built with the same attention to aesthetics as a military barracks. Inside, goods were displayed behind counters, not because of concerns about theft, though that was certainly a consideration, but because interaction with the merchandise was a privilege that had to be mediated by store clerks who functioned as much debt collection agents as retail employees. The clerks knew your credit history better than you did. They knew how much you owed, when your last payment was made, and exactly how much credit you had available for new purchases. They also knew which items were marked up the highest and would steer you toward those whenever possible. Need flour. They'd recommend the imported wheat flour at twice the price of the local product. Need work clothes. They'd suggest the premium canvas overalls that cost 3 times as much as the basic version and lasted maybe 20% longer. The quality of goods was carefully calibrated to ensure repeat business. Food was edible, but not nutritious enough to keep you healthy. Clothes were sturdy enough to last, but not comfortable enough to forget you were wearing them. Tools were functional but prone to breakage, at exactly the moment when replacing them would be most inconvenient and expensive. The medicine sold at the company store was particularly creative in its approach to healthcare. Patent medicines with impressive names and questionable ingredients were sold at prices that made professional medical care, not that there was any available, seem affordable by comparison. Dr. Morrison's miracle elixir promised to cure everything from consumption to moral weakness and cost more per ounce than fine whiskey. The fact that it was mostly alcohol with a few herbs mixed in for colour was beside the point. It made you feel better temporarily, which was all that mattered when your lungs were slowly filling with coal dust, and your back was permanently damaged from years of crouching in mine tunnels. The store's alcohol selection was particularly robust, not because the company wanted to encourage drinking, but because alcohol was one of the few pleasures available to miners, and therefore one of the most reliable sources of profit. Whiskey, beer, and various forms of rocket liquor were available at prices that ensured a significant portion of every miner's wages would be converted directly into intoxication. The company didn't mind if their workers drank themselves into stupors on weekends. Drunk miners didn't cause labor troubles, didn't organize unions, and didn't ask uncomfortable questions about working conditions. The credit system created a peculiar form of economic slavery. You could work for years, earning what seemed like decent wages, and still owe the company more money at the end of each month than you had at the beginning. The debt grew faster than your ability to pay it off, creating a mathematical impossibility that the company was happy to maintain indefinitely. Some miners worked their entire careers without ever seeing actual cash money, their wages flowing directly from the payroll office to the company's store's books without ever passing through their hands. Children born in mining towns often inherited their parents' debts along with their prospects for employment. A son who went to work in the mines might find himself starting his career already owing the company money for his childhood medical expenses, his mother's grocery bills, and his father's funeral costs. The debt was hereditary, passed down through generations like a family curse that could only be broken by leaving the mining community entirely. Something that was nearly impossible when you owed more money than you could earn in a lifetime. The company store also served as a social control mechanism. Miners who caused trouble, who talked about organizing unions, who complained about working conditions, who asked too many questions about safety, might find their credit suddenly restricted or their debt called in immediately. Store clerks were encouraged to report on conversations they overheard, political opinions expressed while shopping, and any signs of dissatisfaction with the company's policies. The store wasn't just a place of business. It was a surveillance operation disguised as retail. Women in mining communities had their own special relationship with the company store. Since most families lived paycheck to paycheck, or rather, scrip payment to scrip payment, women were responsible for stretching every dollar to cover the basic necessities of life. This meant developing a sophisticated understanding of the credit system, learning to negotiate with store clerks, and finding creative ways to feed and clothe a family on wages that were designed to be insufficient. The store's pricing for women's goods was particularly exploitative. A bolt of fabric that might cost 50 cents in town would cost $2 at the company store. Children's shoes, already expensive because of their specialized sizes, were marked up to prices that ensured many children went barefoot rather than bankrupt their families. Women's medicine, particularly anything related to reproductive health, came at premium prices that reflected both the limited availability and the captive market. The company store's business model was so effective that it became the template for economic exploitation throughout the industrial world. The system was copied by textile mills, lumber companies, railroad construction crews, and anywhere else that workers could be isolated from normal market forces and made dependent on a single employer for both income and necessities. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the company store was how it normalized economic injustice. Miners and their families came to accept debt as a natural condition, like the weather or the color of their hair. Children grew up understanding that adults owed money to the company, that this debt was permanent and ever growing, and that working in the mines was both the cause of the debt and the only possible solution to it. The system created its own culture, its own values, and its own twisted logic that made exploitation seem like opportunity and debt seem like a form of employment security. The company store wasn't just a business, it was a complete economic ecosystem designed to extract value from human suffering with ruthless efficiency. It turned basic human needs into profit centers, converted desperation into credit scores, and transformed the simple act of survival into a complex financial instrument that benefited everyone except the people who actually did the work. Living in a company town was like being a character in a play written by someone who really didn't like you very much. Every aspect of your existence, where you lived, where you shopped, where your children went to school, where you worshipped, and where you'd eventually be buried, was controlled by the same entity that employed you. The company wasn't just your employer, it was your landlord, your government, your police force, and often your bank. It was a totalitarian system disguised as capitalism, and you were both the labor force and the product being consumed. The houses in company towns were built with the same attention to comfort and aesthetics as military barracks, which is to say, none at all. They were identical wooden boxes, usually painted the same color S, if they were painted at all, arranged in neat rows that made the town look like a cemetery for the living. The design was purely functional: 4 walls, a roof, and enough space to sleep a family without everyone dying of suffocation. Privacy was a luxury concept that hadn't been included in the architectural plans. A typical company house consisted of 2 or 3 rooms for an entire family. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and living room. 1 or 2 bedrooms accommodated everyone else, which meant children slept 3 or 4 to a bed. Parents shared space with infants. And privacy was something that happened only in your imagination. The walls were thin enough that you could hear your neighbors' conversations, arguments, and more intimate moments whether you wanted to or not. In winter, the houses were freezing. In summer, they were stifling. And year-round, they were reminders that your living situation was entirely dependent on your employment status. The rent for these palatial accommodations was automatically deducted from your wages, along with charges for water, sewage errors if the town was fancy enough to have sewage, and maintenance. The maintenance charges were particularly creative, covering not just repairs to your house, but improvements to the entire town that you may or may not have wanted or needed. A new roof for the company store. That was partly your expense. Repairs to the mine superintendent's mansion. Your contribution was appreciated and mandatory. The water system in company towns was a marvel of creative engineering and selective service. The mine itself required enormous amounts of water for operations, so the company would build elaborate systems to bring water from distant sources. The mine got first priority, of course, followed by the company offices, then the homes of management, and finally, if there was anything left, the workers' houses. During dry seasons, miners' families might find themselves without running water while the mine's operations continued uninterrupted and the superintendent's garden remained green and lush. Sewage systems, when they existed at all, followed the same priorities. The company's facilities were connected to proper drainage systems. Management housing had indoor plumbing and flush toilets. Worker housing often made do with outdoor privies and open drainage ditches that created their own public health challenges. Disease spread quickly through company towns, not because of any lack of medical knowledge, but because proper sanitation was expensive and workers' health was not considered a high priority investment. The streets in company towns were usually unpaved dirt roads that turned into mud bogs during rain and dust storms during dry weather. Street maintenance was minimal, because improved roads would make it easier for workers to travel to other towns, potentially seeking employment elsewhere. The company preferred its workforce to be geographically isolated as well as economically trapped. Lighting was provided by oil lamps or gas lights, if it was provided at all. The main roads might have a few streetlights, more for the convenience of company officials than for worker safety. Workers' neighborhoods were often left in darkness after sunset, which had the added benefit of making it difficult for people to gather and organize any sort of collective action. Education in company towns was a carefully controlled affair. The company usually built and operated the school, hired the teachers, and determined the curriculum. Children learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, skills that were useful for keeping track of family debts and understanding work orders. They also learned company loyalty, the importance of hard work, and the natural order of things that put mine owners at the top and miners at the bottom. Critical thinking was not encouraged. History lessons focused on the benefits of industrial progress and the generosity of company founders. Science was limited to practical applications that might be useful in mining operations. Teachers in company schools were often young women from outside the community, recruited because they would work for low wages and were unlikely to have established relationships with mining families that might compromise their loyalty to company policies. They lived in company housing, shopped at the company store, and understood that their employment depended on their willingness to promote company values rather than independent thought. Children in company towns grew up understanding that their future was predetermined. Boys would work in the mines when they came of age. Girls would marry miners and raise the next generation of workers. Education beyond the basics was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Too much learning might give young people ideas about life outside the mining community. The company often provided religious services as well, either by building a church and hiring a minister, or by bringing in traveling preachers who could be counted on to deliver sermons that emphasized the virtues of hard work, acceptance of one's station in life, and the rewards that awaited the faithful in the afterlife. Religion in company towns was less about spiritual development and more about social control, providing comfort for current suffering while discouraging any efforts to improve conditions in this world. Medical care was minimal and expensive. The company might employ a doctor, but his primary responsibility was to determine whether injured workers could return to work and to certify deaths for insurance purposes. Serious medical conditions often went untreated because the cost of treatment exceeded a family's ability to pay, and the company's interest in worker health extended only as far as their ability to perform their jobs. The doctor was also responsible for determining which injuries were work-related and which were not, a distinction that could mean the difference between receiving some compensation and receiving nothing at all. Surprisingly, most injuries were determined to be the result of worker carelessness rather than dangerous working conditions, and most illnesses were attributed to lifestyle choices rather than occupational hazards. Women in company towns faced their own unique challenges. Their economic security depended entirely on their husband's employment, making them particularly vulnerable to any disruption in family income. They were responsible for making inadequate wages stretch to cover family needs, managing households in substandard housing, and raising children in an environment that offered few opportunities for advancement. Many women took in laundry, sewing, or boarders to supplement family income, but these activities were often restricted by company policies. Taking in boarders meant housing non-company employees, which was sometimes prohibited. Running a business from your home violated lease agreements. Even growing a garden to supplement the family's food supply might be restricted if the company wanted to maintain control over the appearance of the town. The social hierarchy in company towns was as rigid as a military organization and about as subtle as a brick to the face. At the top were the mine owners and major shareholders, who rarely lived in the company town, but whose presence was felt in every policy and decision. Below them were the mine superintendents and managers, who lived in larger houses on the better side of town, sent their children to private schools, and socialized exclusively with each other. The middle tier consisted of skilled workers, engineers, supervisors, and clerks, who earned slightly better wages and lived in slightly better housing, but were still entirely dependent on company goodwill for their positions. They served as a buffer between management and the general workforce, implementing policies they might not agree with and enforcing rules they might not understand. At the bottom were the miners themselves, along with their families. They lived in the smallest houses, earned the lowest wages, faced the greatest risks, and had the least influence over their living and working conditions. Within this group, there were further subdivisions based on nationality, race, and length of employment, divisions that the company actively encouraged to prevent workers from uniting around common interests. Recent immigrants were often housed in the worst sections of town and paid lower wages for the same work. African American miners, when they were employed at all, faced additional restrictions on where they could live and what facilities they could use. These divisions weren't accidental. They were deliberate strategies to prevent the formation of unified labor movements that might challenge company authority. Entertainment in company towns was limited and controlled. The company might operate a saloon, which served the dual purpose of providing a place for workers to spend their wages and keeping them too intoxicated to organize effectively. Gambling was often available, providing another mechanism for separating workers from their money. Sports were encouraged, particularly competitive activities that channeled aggressive impulses into harmless competitions rather than labor activism. Reading material was carefully curated. The company store might sell newspapers and magazines, but only those that promoted acceptable political views and social values. Books were expensive and limited in selection. Libraries, when they existed at all, were stocked with materials that emphasized the benefits of industrial progress and the importance of accepting one's role in the economic system. The company town's legal system was simple and efficient. The company made the rules, the company enforced the rules, and the company decided what happened to rule breakers. Local law enforcement, when it existed, was usually employed by the company rather than by any governmental authority. The sheriff, constable, or security guards were company employees whose job was to maintain order as defined by company interests. This meant that labor disputes were criminal matters. Union organizing was treated as a form of trespassing or incitement, and any challenge to company authority was dealt with swiftly and decisively. Workers who caused trouble might find themselves evicted from company housing, blacklisted from employment, or simply beaten and run out of town by company security forces. The judicial system was equally streamlined. Company towns often had their own justices of the peace, who were either company employees or individuals whose income depended on company approval. Trials were quick, sentences were predetermined, and appeals were theoretical concepts that had no practical application in company-controlled jurisdictions. The isolation of company towns was both geographical and social. They were usually located near coal deposits rather than near existing communities, which meant they were often miles from the nearest independent town or city. This isolation made it difficult for workers to seek employment elsewhere. to compare their conditions with those of workers in other industries, or to maintain connections with people outside the mining community. Transportation was controlled by the company as well. The railroad lines that brought coal out of the mountains might also be company-owned, and passenger service was limited and expensive. Roads were poor and often impassable during bad weather. Horse ownership was expensive and impractical for workers who could barely afford to feed their families, let alone maintain livestock. This isolation also meant that outside influences, labor organizers, journalists, government inspectors, or anyone else who might question the company's policies, could be easily identified and excluded. Visitors to company towns were watched. Their activities were monitored, and their interactions with local residents were subject to company oversight. The company town was a complete ecosystem of control, designed to extract maximum value from human labor while minimizing the costs of maintaining that labor force. Every aspect of life was commoditized. Every relationship was mediated by economic considerations, and every individual was reduced to their function within the larger machine of coal production. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of company town life was how it normalized these conditions. Children grew up believing that this was simply how the world worked. Adults accepted exploitation as a natural condition. Families adapted to substandard living conditions and made them seem normal through the simple act of surviving them day after day, year after year. The company town wasn't just a place where coal miners lived. It was a social engineering experiment that demonstrated how completely human beings could be controlled when their basic needs for shelter, food, and employment were all dependent on a single source. It was capitalism stripped of any pretense about free markets or individual choice, reduced to its essential element, the conversion of human desperation into corporate profit. If you thought the company town was designed to kill you slowly, wait until you got a load of the mine itself. The underground workplace was a masterclass in creative ways to die, featuring dangers that ranged from the obvious and immediate to the subtle and lingering. Every day in the mine was like playing Russian roulette with a gun that had bullets in 5 of the 6 chambers, except the bullets were cave-ins, explosions, flooding, poisonous gases, and industrial accidents, and the empty chamber was just another way to get killed that hadn't been invented yet. Cave-ins were the classic mining hazard, the greatest hit of underground death, the danger that every miner understood and feared. The principle was simple. You were working in tunnels carved out of rock and coal, held up by wooden props that were installed by the lowest bidder and maintained by people who were paid by the linear foot rather than by safety standards. Above your head were millions of tons of rock, coal, and earth, all of which were subject to the fundamental force of gravity and the basic principle that everything wants to fall down. The props, wooden beams that held up the tunnel ceiling, were supposed to be installed according to engineering principles and safety standards. In practice, they were installed according to budget constraints and schedule pressures. Good timber was expensive, so companies often used whatever wood was available locally, regardless of its structural properties. Oak was ideal, but pine was cheaper. Fresh timber was best, but recycled wood from previous construction projects was more economical. The spacing of props was supposed to be determined by geological surveys and engineering calculations. In reality, it was often determined by rules of thumb, company policies designed to minimize timber costs, and the personal judgment of foremen who were more concerned with meeting production quotas than with keeping miners alive. Props might be spaced too far apart, installed at the wrong angles, or simply omitted entirely in areas where the ceiling looked stable enough. The warning signs of an impending cave-in were well known to experienced miners. Creaking sounds from the props, small falls of rock or coal from the ceiling, changes in air pressure, and the distinctive talking sounds that timber made when it was under stress. The problem was that these warning signs were also the normal sounds of a working mine. Timber always creaked, small debris always fell, and air pressure constantly changed as ventilation systems operated and workers moved through the tunnels. This meant that miners had to develop an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between normal underground sounds and the specific sounds that meant death was imminent. It was like being a doctor who could diagnose a heart attack by listening to a patient's breathing. Except the patient was a mountain and the diagnosis had to be made in near darkness while swinging a pickaxe. Even experienced miners got it wrong. A sound that seemed normal could be the prelude to a catastrophic collapse. A section of tunnel that had been stable for months could suddenly give way without warning. Props that had been installed just days before could fail if they'd been cut from green timber that was still shrinking as it dried, or if they'd been damaged during installation, or if the ground conditions had changed due to water infiltration or shifting geological pressures. When a cave-in occurred, it happened fast. Tons of rock, coal, and earth would come crashing down, filling tunnels, crushing anything in their path, and often sealing off entire sections of the mine. Miners caught in cave-ins faced several equally unpleasant possibilities. They could be crushed instantly, which was probably the best case scenario. They could be trapped but alive, facing slow death by suffocation or thirst, or they could be injured but not killed, trapped in darkness with broken bones and no realistic hope of rescue. Rescue operations were dangerous, expensive, and often futile. Digging through a cave-in meant risking additional collapses that could kill the rescuers as well as the trapped miners. The process was slow, requiring careful removal of debris and installation of new props to prevent further collapses. Many rescue attempts had to be abandoned when it became clear that reaching the trapped miners would require more time and money than the company was willing to invest. The cruel mathematics of cave-in rescues meant that companies often had to weigh the cost of rescue operations against the cost of hiring replacement workers. A rescue that might take weeks, require dozens of workers, and consume expensive materials and equipment might cost more than simply writing off the trapped miners as a business loss and recruiting new workers to replace them. Explosions were the spectacular way to die in a mine, the dramatic exit that made newspaper headlines and caused investigations by government officials who would ultimately conclude that mining was inherently dangerous and that accidents were an unfortunate but inevitable part of the coal extraction process. Most mine explosions were caused by methane gas, a natural byproduct of coal formation that accumulated in underground spaces and turned the entire mine into a potential bomb. Methane was colorless, odorless, and explosive when mixed with air in concentrations between 5% and 15%. Below 5%, it was harmless. Above 15%, it was too rich to ignite. But in that sweet spot of 5% to 15%, it would explode with devastating force at the slightest spark. The sources of ignition in a mine were numerous and often unavoidable. Oil lamps and candles provided the light that miners needed to work, but they also provided the open flames that could turn a methane-filled tunnel into an inferno. Later, when electric lighting was introduced, sparks from electrical equipment became another source of ignition. Even the steel on rock contact when a pickaxe hit stone could create sparks sufficient to trigger an explosion. Ventilation systems were supposed to prevent dangerous accumulations of methane by moving fresh air through the mine and carrying the gas away before it could reach explosive concentrations. But ventilation systems were expensive to install and maintain, and they didn't always work as designed. A fan failure, a blocked air shaft, or a change in barometric pressure could disrupt airflow and allow gas to accumulate in deadly concentrations. Some areas of mines were more prone to gas accumulations than others. Low-lying areas were heavier than air gases could settle. Dead-end tunnels where air circulation was poor, and newly opened coal faces where fresh coal was releasing gas were all particularly dangerous. But gas could accumulate anywhere, and concentrations could change rapidly as mining operations progressed and geological conditions changed. Mine explosions were devastating events that could kill dozens of workers instantly and destroy entire sections of underground workings. The blast itself would kill anyone in the immediate area, but the effects extended far beyond the explosion site. The blast would consume oxygen throughout the mine, suffocating miners who were nowhere near the original explosion. It would bring down tunnel ceilings, blocking escape routes and trapping survivors. It would destroy ventilation systems, filling the mine with poisonous gases and smoke. Even miners who survived the initial explosion often died in the aftermath. They might be trapped by cave-ins caused by the blast, suffocated by poisonous gases released by the explosion, or burned by fires that continued to rage underground for days or weeks after the initial event. Some mine fires burned for years, making entire mines unusable and creating ongoing hazards for anyone attempting rescue or recovery operations. The investigation of mine explosions was a carefully choreographed exercise in blame avoidance. Company officials would express shock and dismay at the tragic accident. Government inspectors would examine the site and usually conclude that the explosion was caused by worker carelessness. A miner who ignored safety procedures, a foreman who failed to test for gas, or a lamp that was improperly maintained. The structural problems that made explosions inevitable, inadequate ventilation, poor safety training, pressure to maintain production schedules regardless of safety conditions, were rarely addressed in any meaningful way. Water was another constant threat in underground mines. Coal deposits were often located in areas with high water tables, underground streams, or geological formations that acted as natural reservoirs. Mining operations involved digging holes in the ground, and water, following the basic principles of gravity and hydrostatics, wanted to fill those holes. Small amounts of water were a constant nuisance, creating muddy working conditions, making tunnels slippery, and contributing to respiratory problems as miners breathed humid air filled with coal dust. But large amounts of water could be instantly fatal, turning mine tunnels into underground rivers and drowning miners who couldn't escape quickly enough. Water influx could happen suddenly and without warning. A pickaxe might break through into an underground stream, releasing thousands of gallons of water into the mine. Heavy rains on the surface could saturate the ground and increase water pressure underground, causing seeps to become flows and flows to become floods. Changes in mining operations might disrupt underground drainage patterns, causing water that had been flowing harmlessly away from work areas to suddenly pour into tunnels where miners were working. The pumping systems that were supposed to keep mines dry were expensive, complicated, and prone to failure. Steam-powered pumps required constant fuel, regular maintenance, and skilled operators. When they worked, they could move enormous amounts of water. When they failed, entire sections of mines could flood within hours. Flooding was particularly dangerous because it happened in an environment where escape routes were limited and well defined. Miners working in deep tunnels might have only one or two ways to reach the surface, and if those routes were blocked by water, the miners were trapped. Unlike cave-ins, which might create air pockets where trapped miners could survive for hours or days, flooding filled all available space with water, leaving no room for survival. The gases produced by coal mining created their own catalogue of ways to die, each with its own characteristics and its own particular form of unpleasantness. Carbon monoxide was the silent killer, produced by incomplete combustion of coal or timber and capable of causing death without any obvious symptoms. Miners affected by carbon monoxide poisoning might simply lie down and never get up again, their bodies shutting down as their blood lost its ability to carry oxygen. Carbon dioxide was heavier than air and tended to accumulate in low, lying areas of mines, creating invisible pools of death that could kill miners who stepped into them. Unlike carbon monoxide, which killed slowly and painlessly, carbon dioxide caused obvious distress, gasping, panic, and desperate attempts to escape. But death came quickly for anyone who couldn't get out of the affected area immediately. Hydrogen sulfide, produced by the decomposition of organic matter in stagnant water, was toxic in small concentrations and instantly fatal in large ones. It had a distinctive rotten egg smell in low concentrations, but in high concentrations it destroyed the sense of smell, meaning that miners might walk into lethal concentrations without any warning. The mining company's approach to gas hazards was to require miners to carry canaries in small cages. The theory was that canaries were more sensitive to poisonous gases than humans and would die first, providing an early warning system that would allow miners to evacuate before the gas concentrations became lethal to people. In practice, this meant that miners carried around small birds, whose primary job was to die, in order to warn the miners that they were about to die too. The canary system had several obvious flaws. First, it only worked for gases that killed canaries faster than they killed humans, which wasn't true for all dangerous gases. Second, it required miners to constantly monitor the health of their canaries, while performing physically demanding and mentally absorbing work in dangerous conditions. Third, a dead canary told you that the air was poisonous, but it didn't tell you what kind of poison it was, how concentrated it was, or how quickly you needed to evacuate. But perhaps most importantly, the canary system placed the responsibility for gas detection on individual miners rather than on the company's ventilation and safety systems. Instead of investing in proper air monitoring equipment and ventilation systems that would prevent dangerous gas accumulations, companies could simply give each miner a canary and claim that they had provided adequate safety measures. Industrial accidents in mines were creativity exercises in the malicious application of physics and mechanical engineering. The equipment used in mining operations was heavy, powerful, and designed for efficiency rather than safety. Steam engines, hoisting equipment, pumps, and coal cars all had the potential to crush, cut, burn, or otherwise damage human bodies in ways that would have impressed medieval torture specialists. The hoisting systems that lifted miners and coal to the surface were particularly dangerous. These systems used steam engines to wind steel cables around large drums, raising and lowering cages that carried men and materials between the surface and the underground workings. The cables were under enormous tension, the machinery operated at high speeds, and safety devices were minimal or non-existent. Cable failures were catastrophic events that sent cages plummeting down mine shafts at speeds that turned human bodies into unrecognizable debris. The cages themselves were minimally constructed iron boxes with gaps between the floorboards and minimal protective barriers. Men could fall through the gaps, be caught between the cage and the shaft walls, or be crushed when cages collided with each other or with obstacles in the shaft. The steam engines that powered hoisting systems were operated by engineers whose training was often minimal and whose attention to safety procedures was influenced by production pressures and scheduled demands. An engineer who operated too slowly would be criticized for reducing productivity. An engineer who operated too quickly might kill dozens of men, but if no accidents occurred, his efficiency would be praised. Underground transportation systems were equally hazardous. Coal cars were pushed through narrow tunnels by human power, creating opportunities for workers to be crushed between cars and tunnel walls, run over by runaway cars, or injured when cars derailed in confined spaces. The rails were often uneven, the cars were overloaded, and the tunnels were too narrow to provide safe clearance for workers. Loading and unloading coal cars required workers to position themselves in dangerous relationships with heavy, moving objects. A coal car that broke free from its moorings could roll down inclined tracks at speeds that made escape impossible. Workers loading cars had to position themselves where they could be crushed if the car moved unexpectedly, or if the loading mechanism failed. The tools used in mining were designed to break apart rock and coal, and they were equally effective at breaking apart human bodies. Pickaxes were heavy iron implements swung with considerable force in confined spaces where workers couldn't see clearly and were often working in awkward positions. Accidents with pickaxes could result in cuts, puncture wounds, and crush injuries that were difficult to treat and often became infected. Explosives were used to break apart coal faces and clear obstacles, but explosive handling in the 19th century was a combination of chemistry and prayer that often ended badly. Black powder and later dynamite were unstable, sensitive to heat and shock, and prone to unexpected detonation. Miners handling explosives might be killed by premature explosions, injured by flying debris from blasts, or poisoned by the toxic gases produced by explosive compounds. The process of setting charges required miners to drill holes in coal faces, insert explosive charges, and then retreat to safe distances before detonation. But safe distances in narrow mine tunnels were often theoretical concepts, and the timing mechanisms used to trigger explosions were primitive and unreliable. Miners might be caught too close to blasts, or they might return too soon to areas where delayed charges had not yet exploded. The cumulative effect of all these dangers was that working in a mine was like playing a daily lottery, where all the prizes were different ways to die or be permanently disabled. Every day that a miner survived was essentially a small miracle, a temporary victory over physics, chemistry, and industrial design that seemed determined to convert human beings into casualty statistics. But perhaps the most insidious danger was the way that constant exposure to these hazards normalized the concept of sudden, violent death. Miners developed a fatalistic attitude toward their own mortality, not because they were naturally pessimistic, but because optimism was a luxury they couldn't afford. Hope for long-term survival was inconsistent with the daily reality of working in an environment where death was not just possible but probable. This psychological adaptation to extreme danger created its own problems. Miners who became too comfortable with risk might take unnecessary chances, while miners who remained appropriately terrified might be paralyzed by fear and unable to work effectively. The balance between healthy caution and functional denial was a delicate one that many miners never successfully achieved. The company's response to these dangers was to treat them as natural and inevitable aspects of coal mining, rather than as problems that could be solved through better engineering, improved safety procedures, or higher investment in protective equipment. Accidents were attributed to worker carelessness, acts of God, or the inherent risks of the mining profession rather than to corporate decisions that prioritized profit over human life. This approach had the convenient effect of absolving companies of responsibility for improving safety conditions while placing the burden of risk management on individual workers who had neither the knowledge nor the resources to protect themselves effectively. It was a system that privatized the risks of coal mining while socializing the profits, ensuring that the people who benefited from mining operations never had to face the dangers that made those operations profitable. If the immediate dangers of mining didn't kill you, and statistically speaking, they probably wouldn't, at least not right away, then the long-term health effects would finish the job with the patience and thoroughness of a dedicated professional. Coal mining wasn't just a dangerous occupation, it was a slow-motion medical experiment designed to test the limits of human endurance, lung capacity, and tolerance for industrial poisoning. The most obvious health problem facing coal miners was pneumoconiosis, known more commonly as black lung disease, though that cheerful nickname barely captured the reality of what was happening inside miners' bodies. Every breath taken in a coal mine contained particles of coal dust, rock dust, and various other substances that had no business being inside human lungs. These particles were too small to be filtered out by the nose and throat, too persistent to be cleared by normal respiratory functions, and too chemically active to be ignored by the body's immune system. The progression of black lung disease was as predictable as it was horrifying. In the early stages, miners would develop what they called miner's cough, a persistent, hacking cough that brought up black phlegm and gradually worsened over time. This was the body's increasingly desperate attempt to clear foreign particles from the lungs, an effort that was doomed to failure because the particles were too deeply embedded in lung tissue to be removed by coughing. As the disease progressed, the constant irritation caused by coal dust would trigger the formation of scar tissue in the lungs. This scar tissue was the body's attempt to isolate and contain the foreign particles, but it had the unfortunate side effect of reducing the lungs' ability to transfer oxygen to the blood. Breathing became increasingly difficult, first during physical exertion and eventually even at rest. In the advanced stages of the disease, miners would develop what doctors called progressive massive fibrosis, a condition in which large areas of lung tissue were replaced by useless scar tissue. Miners with advanced black lung disease could barely walk across a room without gasping for breath. They couldn't work, couldn't engage in normal physical activities, and often couldn't sleep lying down because the effort of breathing while horizontal was too exhausting. The final stage was respiratory failure and death, usually preceded by years of increasing disability and suffering. There was no cure for black lung disease, no treatment that could reverse the damage, and no way to prevent it other than avoiding exposure to coal dust, which was impossible for anyone who worked in a mine. The medical establishment's understanding of occupational lung disease in the 19th century was primitive at best and willfully ignorant at worst. Company doctors, when they existed, were primarily concerned with determining whether injured or sick workers could return to their jobs rather than with providing effective medical treatment. The connection between coal dust exposure and respiratory disease was obvious to anyone who spent time around miners, But acknowledging this connection would have required companies to take expensive steps to reduce dust exposure or to compensate workers for occupational injuries. Instead, company doctors and medical researchers found creative ways to attribute miners' respiratory problems to other causes. Black lung disease was blamed on tobacco use. Despite the fact that many miners who had never used tobacco developed the condition, it was attributed to genetic predisposition, moral weakness, or lifestyle choices rather than to the obvious occupational hazard of breathing coal dust for years or decades. The diagnostic process for black lung disease was often a bureaucratic exercise designed to minimize company liability rather than to provide accurate medical assessment. Company doctors would perform cursory examinations, often concluding that miners with obvious symptoms of advanced lung disease were suffering from minor respiratory complaints that wouldn't prevent them from working. Independent medical examinations were expensive and usually unavailable to miners who couldn't afford private medical care. Even when black lung disease was properly diagnosed, the legal and compensation systems were designed to minimize financial impacts on mining companies. Workers' compensation laws, when they existed at all, were written with strict definitions of occupational illness that made it difficult to prove that lung disease was related to mining work rather than to other factors. The burden of proof was placed on sick miners who rarely had the medical knowledge, legal resources, or financial means to successfully pursue compensation claims. The treatment options available to miners with respiratory disease were limited and largely ineffective. Patent medicines promised to cure consumption, clear the lungs, and restore healthy breathing, but they were mostly alcohol and herbs with no actual therapeutic value. Professional medical care was expensive and often focused on treating symptoms rather than addressing underlying disease processes. Miners with advanced lung disease were often prescribed complete rest and clean air, recommendations that were impossible to follow for workers whose only source of income required them to continue working in the conditions that had caused their illness in the first place. The advice to avoid dust exposure was about as practical as suggesting that fish avoid water, technically sound medical advice that was completely incompatible with economic reality. But respiratory disease was only one of the health problems facing coal miners. The physical demands of mining work created their own catalogue of medical complications. The constant crouching, crawling, and working in awkward positions required by mine work led to severe back problems, joint degeneration, and muscle damage that affected miners' ability to perform even simple daily activities. Miners developed distinctive physical deformities from their work. Permanently curved spines from years of working in low tunnels, enlarged shoulder and arm muscles from swinging pickaxes, and damaged knees and ankles from crawling over rough surfaces and working on uneven ground. These physical changes were so characteristic of mining work that experienced miners could be identified by their posture and gait even when they were away from the mine. The repetitive stress injuries caused by mining work were not recognized as legitimate medical conditions in the 19th century. Miners who complained of back pain, joint stiffness, or muscle weakness were often dismissed as malingerers or weaklings trying to avoid work. The concept that certain types of work could cause cumulative damage to the human body was not widely accepted by the medical establishment, and workers who developed these problems were expected to continue working until they were physically unable to do so. Accidents and injuries in mines created their own medical challenges. Even minor cuts and bruises could become serious infections in the dirty, contaminated environment of underground mining. Coal dust and rock particles would get into wounds, making them difficult to clean and prone to infection. The lack of proper medical facilities near most mines meant that injured workers often received minimal treatment and had to continue working with injuries that would have required extended medical care in other occupations. More serious injuries, broken bones, severe cuts, burns from explosions, often resulted in permanent disability or death because proper medical care was not available when it was needed. Even if a severely injured miner could be brought to the surface and transported to a hospital, the delay in receiving treatment often meant the difference between recovery and lifelong disability. The psychological effects of mining work were equally devastating, but even less well understood. Miners worked in conditions of constant danger, surrounded by darkness, in confined spaces that triggered claustrophobic responses in many people. The stress of knowing that each day of work might be their last created psychological pressures that manifested in various ways: alcoholism, domestic violence, depression, and anxiety disorders that had no names or treatments in the 19th century. The isolation and social control of company towns exacerbated these psychological problems. Miners had limited opportunities for social interaction outside of work and family, few recreational activities, and little hope for economic advancement or escape from their circumstances. The combination of physical danger, economic insecurity, and social isolation created conditions that would be recognized today as severely traumatic, but were simply accepted as normal aspects of mining life. Sleep disorders were common among miners, partly because of the physical discomfort caused by their work and partly because of the psychological stress of their occupation. Many miners had difficulty sleeping because of persistent coughing from lung disease, but even healthy miners often suffered from insomnia, nightmares, and other sleep disturbances related to the stress of their work. Nutritional problems were endemic in mining communities. The combination of high physical demands and limited access to quality food meant that many miners were chronically malnourished despite consuming large quantities of calories. The company store's limited selection of expensive, low-quality food contributed to diets that were heavy on starches and fats, but lacking in the vitamins and minerals necessary for good health. Scurvy, rickets, and other diseases associated with nutritional deficiencies were common in mining communities, particularly among children. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, combined with limited exposure to sunlight important for vitamin D synthesis, created conditions that were ideal for the development of diseases that were rare in other communities. Dental health was particularly poor among miners and their families. The combination of poor nutrition, limited access to dental care, and the tendency to lose teeth in mining accidents meant that many miners lost most of their teeth by middle age. This created additional nutritional problems as miners became unable to chew food properly, further limiting their already inadequate diets. Women in mining communities faced their own unique health challenges. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous under the best of circumstances in the 19th century, but the combination of poor nutrition, contaminated water supplies, and limited access to medical care made pregnancy particularly hazardous for miners' wives. Infant mortality rates in mining communities were significantly higher than national averages, and many women died in childbirth or from complications related to pregnancy. The constant exposure to coal dust didn't just affect miners, it affected their entire families. Miners brought coal dust home on their clothes, skin, and hair, contaminating their living spaces and exposing family members to the same particles that caused lung disease in miners. Children in mining communities often developed respiratory problems that were attributed to other causes but were actually the result of secondary exposure to coal dust. The water supplies in mining communities were often contaminated with runoff from mining operations, containing heavy metals, chemical compounds, and other substances that caused a variety of health problems. Lead poisoning, mercury poisoning, and other forms of heavy metal toxicity were common but poorly understood. The symptoms, neurological problems, digestive issues, skin conditions, were often attributed to other causes or simply accepted as normal aspects of life in mining communities. The medical care available to mining families was minimal and often provided by doctors whose primary loyalty was to the mining company rather than to their patients. Company doctors were expected to minimize medical expenses and to return workers to productive employment as quickly as possible. This created conflicts of interest that often resulted in inadequate medical care and misdiagnosis of occupational illnesses. Independent medical care was usually too expensive for mining families to afford. Even when miners could scrape together the money for private medical consultation, the nearest qualified doctors might be hundreds of miles away. Emergency medical care was virtually non-existent in most mining communities, meaning that serious accidents or sudden illnesses often resulted in death, simply because proper medical treatment was not available. The cumulative effect of all these health problems was that life expectancy for coal miners was significantly shorter than for men in other occupations. Miners who survived the immediate dangers of their work often died in their 40s or 50s from lung disease, heart problems related to respiratory illness, or the cumulative effects of years of exposure to industrial toxins and physical abuse. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the health problems facing coal miners was that most of them were preventable. Better ventilation systems could have reduced dust exposure. Proper safety equipment could have prevented many accidents. Adequate medical care could have treated many conditions before they became life-threatening. Improved nutrition and living conditions could have strengthened miners' ability to resist disease and recover from injuries. The technology and knowledge necessary to create safer working conditions existed in the 19th century. But implementing these improvements would have reduced company profits. The decision to prioritize financial returns over human health was a conscious choice made by people who never had to face the consequences of their decisions. The health problems of coal miners weren't natural disasters or unavoidable consequences of industrial progress. They were the predictable results of a system that treated human beings as disposable resources in the pursuit of profit. The mining company's approach to occupational health was to treat it as an individual responsibility rather than a corporate obligation. Workers were expected to accept the health risks of mining as part of their job, just as they accepted the risk of accidents or the certainty of low wages. The idea that companies should invest in protecting workers' health was considered radical and economically impractical. This approach was supported by a medical establishment that was often more interested in maintaining good relationships with corporate clients than in providing objective medical assessment of occupational hazards. Medical research into the health effects of mining was limited and often funded by mining companies with obvious conflicts of interest. The results of this research were predictably favorable to company interests and dismissive of workers' health concerns. The legal system reinforced this approach by making it extremely difficult for workers to seek compensation for occupational illnesses or to force companies to improve working conditions. Courts generally accepted company arguments that workers had voluntarily assumed the risks of their employment, and that companies could not be held responsible for health problems that might have multiple causes. The result was a system in which the people who profited from coal mining never had to bear the costs of the health problems that mining created. Those costs were borne by miners and their families, by communities that dealt with the social consequences of widespread illness and disability, and by society as a whole, which lost the productive potential of men who died prematurely or were disabled by preventable occupational diseases. Family life in a mining community was like trying to maintain a garden in a war zone, theoretically possible, but requiring constant vigilance, creative adaptation, and an acceptance that normal expectations about family life didn't apply to your situation. The mine didn't just claim miners' working hours, it claimed their health, their energy, their future, and often their lives, leaving families to construct some semblance of normal domestic life around the gaping hole where a healthy father and husband should have been. The miner's wife faced challenges that would have broken most people, and were expected to handle them with the cheerful resignation that society demanded of women in the 19th century. Her husband left for work before dawn and returned after dark, covered in coal dust and exhausted from 12 hours of dangerous physical labor. If he returned at all. Every day, she sent him off to work knowing that there was a real possibility he wouldn't come home that evening, and every evening. She waited to see whether today would be the day she became a widow with children to support, and no means of supporting them. The daily routine of a miner's wife started before her husband's. She rose early to prepare his lunch, usually bread, cold meat if the family could afford it, and whatever else could be packed in a tin pail and wouldn't spoil during a 12-hour shift underground. This meal preparation was a daily exercise in creative nutrition, trying to provide enough calories to sustain a man doing back-breaking physical labor while working within a food budget that would barely feed a sedentary clerk. After her husband left for work, her real day began. Washing his work clothes was a daily battle against coal dust that seemed to have been designed by the devil himself to permanently stain everything it touched. The clothes had to be scrubbed by hand with lye soap that was harsh enough to remove coal dust, but also harsh enough to destroy fabric and skin with equal enthusiasm. Water had to be heated over a wood stove, clothes had to be boiled, scrubbed, rinsed, and hung to dry, all while managing whatever other domestic tasks required attention. The coal dust didn't stay on the clothes. It permeated everything: the house, the furniture, the food, the children's toys, and the family's lungs. A miner's wife spent her days fighting a losing battle against coal dust, sweeping it out of corners where it accumulated, wiping it off surfaces where it settled, and trying to keep it out of food where it could make the difference between a barely adequate meal and an inedible one. Managing the family budget was like trying to solve a mathematical equation where the numbers kept changing and the solution was always negative. The company store's prices ensured that even careful budgeting would result in debt. But careful budgeting could mean the difference between manageable debt and complete financial catastrophe. Every purchase had to be weighed against every other need, and there were always more needs than money to address them. A typical family budget might allocate 60% of income to the company store for food, another 20% for rent and utilities, automatically deducted from wages, 10% for clothing and household necessities, and the remaining 10% for medical expenses, emergencies, and debt service. This budget assumed that nothing went wrong, that no one got sick, that no equipment needed replacing, and that the company store's prices remained stable. Since all of these assumptions were unrealistic, most families operated in a state of chronic financial crisis. The psychological burden of managing a family under these conditions was enormous. Wives had to maintain morale and hope while dealing with circumstances that offered little reason for either. They had to comfort children who were hungry, care for husbands who came home exhausted and potentially injured, and maintain households with inadequate resources and constant uncertainty about the future. Many miners' wives developed their own forms of black lung disease from secondary exposure to coal dust, but their respiratory problems were rarely recognized or treated. They were expected to continue their domestic duties, regardless of their own health problems, and their illness was often attributed to moral weakness or failure to maintain proper household hygiene rather than to occupational exposure. The social isolation of company towns was particularly hard on women, who had limited opportunities for social interaction outside their immediate families. The rigid class structure meant that wives of skilled workers socialized separately from wives of general laborers, and wives of management personnel were entirely separate from the wives of workers. This social segregation prevented the formation of broader support networks that might have helped women cope with their common challenges. Children in mining families grew up understanding that their childhood was a temporary luxury that would end as soon as they were old enough to contribute to family income. Boys knew they would work in the mines when they reached adolescence, and girls knew they would marry miners and repeat their mother's struggles with the next generation. Education, when it was available at all, was basic and practical, designed to produce functional workers rather than independent thinkers. The children's daily lives were shaped by the realities of mining, just as much as their parents' lives were. They played in environments contaminated by coal dust and industrial waste. They breathed air that was often barely cleaner than the air inside the mines. They ate food that was nutritionally inadequate and often contaminated with industrial pollutants. They lived in housing that was overcrowded, poorly constructed, and inadequately heated or ventilated. Child mortality rates in mining communities were significantly higher than in other communities, not just because of accidents, but because of the general health conditions that made children more susceptible to disease and less likely to survive common childhood illnesses, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and other diseases that were merely serious in other communities were often fatal in mining towns where children's immune systems were already compromised by poor nutrition and environmental toxins. The children who survived to adolescence often showed the effects of their environment: stunted growth from poor nutrition, respiratory problems from coal dust exposure, and developmental delays from lead poisoning and other environmental toxins. These health problems weren't just individual tragedies. They represented the systematic sacrifice of an entire generation's potential for the sake of coal company profits. Boys typically started working in the mines around age 12 or 13, beginning as breaker boys, whose job was to pick slate and rock out of coal as it moved past them on conveyor belts. This work required quick reflexes, good eyesight, and the ability to distinguish between coal and waste rock, but it also exposed children to the same coal dust that caused black lung disease in adult miners. Breaker boys often lost fingers to the moving machinery, developed respiratory problems that would worsen throughout their lives, and learned to accept industrial accidents as normal parts of their work experience. The progression from breaker boy to full miner was a foregone conclusion for most boys in mining families. There were no other economic opportunities in company towns, no other employers offering decent wages, and no realistic possibility of leaving the community to seek work elsewhere. A boy's education, such as it was, ended when he started working full-time, ensuring that he would never develop the skills or knowledge that might allow him to escape the mining industry. Girls faced their own predetermined future marriage to miners, and the reproduction of the same cycle of poverty, danger, and early death that their mothers had experienced. Their education was even more limited than their brothers, focusing on domestic skills that would help them manage households on inadequate budgets, rather than on any knowledge that might expand their opportunities or horizons. The courtship and marriage patterns in mining communities were shaped by economic necessity rather than romantic choice. Young women married early, partly because marriage offered some economic security, and partly because remaining single was not economically viable in communities where women had few opportunities for independent employment. Young men married early because domestic support was essential for anyone trying to survive on a miner's wages. These early marriages often produced children before either parent was emotionally or economically prepared for the responsibilities of parenthood. Young families struggled with the same financial pressures as older families, but with less experience and fewer resources to help them cope. The result was often a cycle of early parenthood, economic hardship, and limited opportunities that repeated with each generation. The leisure activities available to mining families were limited and often centered around the company-controlled facilities. Company-sponsored picnics, dances, and other social events served the dual purpose of providing some relief from the grinding routine of mining life, while reinforcing company paternalism and social control. These events were carefully managed to promote company loyalty and discourage any activities that might lead to labor organization or political activism. Religious activities were one of the few forms of social organization that companies generally tolerated, partly because religion could serve as a form of social control, and partly because religious leaders could be counted on to preach acceptance of earthly suffering and the importance of obedience to authority. Church services, prayer meetings, and religious festivals provided some community structure and social support, but they also reinforced the message that miners and their families should accept their circumstances as God's will rather than seeking to improve their conditions through collective action. Reading and education beyond the most basic levels were discouraged both by economic necessity and by company policy. Books were expensive, libraries were rare, and parents who worked exhausting physical jobs had little time or energy to spend on their children's intellectual development. The few books that were available in company towns were carefully selected to promote acceptable social values and to discourage independent thinking or criticism of the existing social order. The company school, when it existed, was designed to produce functional workers rather than educated citizens. The curriculum focused on basic literacy, simple arithmetic, and moral instruction that emphasized the virtues of hard work, obedience to authority, and acceptance of one's station in life. Children learned to read well enough to understand work orders and safety instructions, to calculate well enough to keep track of their debts at the company store, and to behave in ways that would make them acceptable employees when they entered the workforce. Higher education was not just unavailable, it was actively discouraged as being inappropriate for children of miners. The idea that a miner's son might become a doctor, lawyer, or teacher was seen as unrealistic and potentially dangerous. since education might give young people ideas about life outside the mining community and make them dissatisfied with their predetermined roles as industrial workers. The few children who showed exceptional academic ability were often prevented from pursuing education by economic necessity rather than lack of opportunity. Families that were struggling to meet basic needs couldn't afford to support a child through extended education, even if educational opportunities had been available. Children were expected to contribute to family income as soon as they were old enough to work. An extended education was seen as a luxury that working-class families couldn't afford. The result was a systematic waste of human potential on an enormous scale. Generation after generation of children grew up in mining communities with talents and abilities that were never developed, dreams and ambitions that were never pursued, and intellectual capacity that was never utilized. This waste wasn't accidental. It was the predictable result of a system that needed large numbers of workers who were desperate enough to accept dangerous, unhealthy work at low wages. The family relationships in mining communities were shaped by the constant presence of danger, economic insecurity, and social isolation. Husbands and wives developed relationships that were based more on mutual survival than on romantic partnership. Parents and children formed bonds that were complicated by the knowledge that children would likely repeat their parents' struggles and limitations. The emotional dynamics of mining families were often strained by the psychological effects of living under constant stress. Miners who came home exhausted and traumatized by their work might be distant or irritable with their families. Wives who spent their days managing impossible financial situations and caring for sick children might have little emotional energy left for marital relationships. Children who grew up knowing that their futures were predetermined might rebel against parental authority or become prematurely resigned to their circumstances. Domestic violence was common in mining communities, not because miners were inherently violent, but because the stress, frustration, and sense of powerlessness created by their circumstances often manifested in violence directed at the only people who were more powerless than they were, their wives and children. The isolation of company towns and the economic dependence of women on their husbands made it difficult for victims of domestic violence to seek help or escape abusive situations. Alcoholism was endemic among miners and often extended to other family members as well. Alcohol provided temporary relief from physical pain, emotional stress, and psychological trauma, but it also consumed money that families couldn't afford to spend and contributed to family dysfunction and violence. The company store's markup on alcohol ensured that drinking problems became financial problems as well as health and social problems. Despite all these challenges, many mining families developed remarkable resilience and found ways to create meaningful lives within the constraints of their circumstances. They formed strong community bonds with other families facing similar challenges, developed creative solutions to practical problems, and maintained hope for their children's futures even when realistic opportunities were limited. The women, in particular, often showed extraordinary strength and resourcefulness in managing their households and caring for their families under impossible conditions. They developed informal networks of mutual support, sharing resources and information that helped families survive crises and navigate the challenges of daily life. They found ways to stretch inadequate budgets, to care for sick family members without professional medical help, and to maintain some sense of dignity and purpose despite living in conditions that were designed to crush human spirit. The children, despite their limited opportunities and poor living conditions, often found ways to create joy and meaning in their lives. They played games, told stories, and formed friendships, and developed dreams that transcended their immediate circumstances. Many grew up to become advocates for better working conditions, educational opportunities, and social justice, using their first-hand knowledge of industrial exploitation to fight for improvements that would benefit future generations. But the systematic nature of the exploitation meant that individual resilience and family strength, while admirable and important, were not sufficient to address the structural problems that made mining communities such difficult places to live and raise children. The problems facing mining families were not the result of personal failures or bad luck. They were the predictable consequences of an economic system that prioritized profit over human welfare and treated workers and their families as expendable resources rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and opportunity. The tragedy of family life in mining communities was not just the individual suffering of particular families, but the waste of human potential on a massive scale. Thousands of children grew up in conditions that prevented them from developing their talents, pursuing their interests, or contributing to society in ways that matched their capabilities. The mining industry's approach to labor relations didn't just exploit adult workers, it systematically destroyed the future prospects of entire generations of children who deserved better opportunities and better lives. The story of labor organization in coal mining communities reads like a military campaign fought by an army of amateurs against professional soldiers who controlled the terrain, the supply lines, and the legal system. Miners' attempts to form unions and improve their working conditions were met with a level of corporate resistance that would have impressed ancient Roman emperors and medieval monarchs. The companies didn't just oppose labor organization, they treated it as a form of treason deserving of swift and brutal punishment. The fundamental challenge facing would-be labor organizers was that everything in a mining community was controlled by the company. The houses where miners lived belonged to the company. The stores where they bought food and supplies were owned by the company. The schools where their children learned were operated by the company. The law enforcement officials who maintained order were employed by the company. Even the churches where miners sought spiritual comfort often depended on company donations and were therefore reluctant to support activities that might antagonize their benefactors. This meant that organizing a union wasn't just a matter of convincing workers to join together for mutual benefit. It was an act of rebellion against a totalitarian system that controlled every aspect of miners' lives. A miner who showed interest in labor organization might find himself evicted from his home, blacklisted from employment, and run out of town by company security forces. His wife might be denied credit at the company store. His children might be expelled from the company school. His entire family might be made into pariahs within the community as an example to others who might consider similar activities. The companies had developed sophisticated intelligence networks to identify and suppress labor organizers before they could gain any significant following. Company stores employed clerks who reported on conversations they overheard while serving customers. Foremen and supervisors were expected to monitor their workers for signs of union sympathies and to report any suspicious activities to management. Even miners themselves were sometimes recruited as informants, either through bribery or through threats to their employment security. The early attempts at labor organization were often led by miners who had experience in other industries or other regions where unions were more established and accepted. These outside organizers brought knowledge of organizing techniques and legal strategies, but they also faced the challenge of operating in communities where they had no local connections and where their presence could be easily detected and reported to company officials. The meetings where miners discussed organizing had to be held in secret, often in remote locations away from company property and company surveillance. Miners would gather in abandoned buildings, in private homes of sympathetic individuals, or even in wooded areas outside of town where they could speak freely without fear of being overheard by company spies. These clandestine meetings gave labor organizing the atmosphere of a revolutionary conspiracy, which was probably an accurate description of what was actually taking place. The issues that motivated miners to risk their jobs and their safety by joining unions were the same issues that made their lives miserable on a daily basis. Dangerous working conditions, low wages, long hours, arbitrary treatment by supervisors, and the economic exploitation of the company store system. But organizing around these issues required miners to overcome not just company opposition, but also their own fear, fatalism, and the legitimate concern that unsuccessful organizing efforts would make their already difficult lives even worse. The company's first line of defense against labor organization was economic intimidation. Miners who were suspected of union activities would find their work assignments changed to less desirable locations in the mine, their hours reduced, or their pay docked for minor infractions of company rules. The message was clear. Workers who caused trouble would find their ability to support their families threatened in ways that had nothing to do with their job performance or work ethic. If economic intimidation wasn't sufficient, companies would escalate to more direct forms of pressure. Suspected union organizers might be called into supervisors' offices for discussions about their future with the company. These conversations, while ostensibly voluntary, were understood by all parties to be threats disguised as employment counseling. Miners would be reminded of their obligations to their families, their debts to the company store, and the difficulty of finding employment elsewhere with a reputation as a troublemaker. The legal system was thoroughly corrupted by company influence, making it virtually impossible for miners to use courts or law enforcement to protect their organizing rights. Local judges were often company employees or individuals whose income depended on company business. Law enforcement officials were either directly employed by mining companies or were so dependent on company cooperation that they could be counted on to interpret any labor dispute in favor of management. This meant that activities that were legally protected forms of free speech and assembly in other parts of the country were treated as criminal conspiracies in mining communities. Miners who attended union meetings could be arrested for trespassing if the meetings were held on or near company property, which included most of the available meeting spaces in company towns. Distributing union literature could be prosecuted as littering or disturbing the peace. Even discussing working conditions with fellow miners could be interpreted as inciting rebellion or interfering with business operations. When miners did manage to organize successful strikes or work stoppages, the company's response was swift and overwhelming. Company security forces, often supplemented by hired thugs or private security agencies, would be brought in to break up picket lines and intimidate striking workers. These security forces operated with the tacit approval of local law enforcement and were rarely held accountable for violence or property destruction committed in the course of breaking strikes. The companies also used economic warfare to defeat strikes. Striking miners would be evicted from company housing, cut off from credit at company stores, and replaced with workers recruited from other regions. The replacements, known as scabs or strike breakers, were often desperate men who were willing to work under dangerous conditions for low wages because they had no other employment options. The presence of strike breakers not only allowed companies to continue operations during strikes, but also created divisions within mining communities between striking miners and replacement workers. The strike breakers were often housed in company, provided barracks, and protected by armed guards, creating armed camps within mining communities and raising the potential for violent confrontations between striking miners and replacement workers. These confrontations sometimes escalated into pitched battles that resembled military engagements more than labor disputes, with casualties on both sides and property destruction that provided companies with justification for calling in additional security forces or requesting military intervention. State and federal governments generally sided with mining companies in labor disputes, viewing strikes and union organizing as threats to economic stability and public order rather than as legitimate expressions of workers' rights. When violence occurred during strikes, the blame was typically placed on outside agitators and radical organizers, rather than on the companies whose policies had created the conditions that led to labor unrest. Military intervention in mining strikes was common and usually decisive. State militias or federal troops would be called in to restore order, which in practice meant breaking strikes, arresting union leaders, and ensuring that mining operations could resume under company terms. The military forces involved in these interventions were often more sympathetic to company management than to striking workers, and their presence generally ended any possibility of successful labor action. The legal aftermath of failed strikes often involved mass arrests, prosecutions for conspiracy and incitement, and blacklisting that made it impossible for identified union organizers to find employment in the mining industry. The message was clear. Workers who challenged company authority would not only lose their immediate struggle, but would also face long-term consequences that would affect their ability to support their families and maintain their place in their communities. Despite these overwhelming obstacles, some miners' unions did achieve limited success, particularly in areas where multiple mining companies competed for workers and where local political conditions were less favorable to unlimited corporate power. The United Mine Workers of America, founded in 1890, became the most successful and enduring of the miners' unions, eventually achieving significant improvements in wages, working conditions, and safety standards. But even successful union organizing required enormous sacrifices from the workers involved. Union leaders faced constant threats to their personal safety and their families' security. Union members had to be prepared to lose their jobs, their homes, and their standing in their communities for the possibility of modest improvements in their working conditions. The company's resistance to labor organization was so determined and so well funded that even successful organizing campaigns often took years to achieve results and required sustained commitment from workers who were already struggling to meet their basic needs. The psychological toll of labor organizing was enormous. Miners who became involved in union activities had to overcome not just their fear of company retaliation, but also their internalized acceptance of the mining industry's authority and their own powerlessness. Many miners had grown up in mining communities and had never known any other economic system. The idea that workers could successfully challenge corporate power required a fundamental shift in worldview that was difficult to achieve and maintain under constant pressure. The wives and families of union organizers faced their own challenges and dangers. They might be ostracized by other mining families who feared guilt by association. Their children might be targeted for harassment at school or in the community. Their access to credit and services might be restricted as punishment for their husband's activities. In some cases, families of union organizers were subjected to direct threats and violence as a way of pressuring miners to abandon their organizing efforts. The company's anti-union strategies were sophisticated and well coordinated. Mining companies shared information about union organizers and maintained blacklists that prevented known activists from finding employment throughout the industry. They employed labor relations specialists who studied union tactics and developed counter-strategies. They lobbied for legislation that would restrict union activities and increase penalties for labor organizing. The propaganda war against unions was as important as the physical and economic warfare. Companies portrayed union organizers as outside agitators who were trying to destroy mining communities and put honest workers out of jobs. They claimed that unions were dominated by foreign radicals who sought to undermine American values and economic prosperity. They argued that union demands were unreasonable and would force mining companies out of business, leaving entire communities without employment. This propaganda was often effective because it played on miners' legitimate fears about economic security and their limited understanding of broader economic and political issues. Many miners had little education and limited access to information sources that weren't controlled by mining companies. They were naturally suspicious of outsiders and were concerned about anything that might threaten their already precarious employment situation. The religious establishments in mining communities often opposed labor organizing, either because they were dependent on company support or because they believed that union activities promoted discord and violated Christian principles of accepting one's station in life. Ministers would preach sermons about the importance of obedience to authority and the dangers of coveting others' wealth. They would counsel miners to trust in God's providence rather than seeking to improve their circumstances through collective action. The ethnic and racial divisions within mining communities were also exploited by companies seeking to prevent union organizing. Different immigrant groups were often pitted against each other, with companies favoring certain nationalities for better jobs and housing while discriminating against others. These divisions made it difficult for miners to see their common interests and to unite around shared concerns about working conditions and wages. Despite all these obstacles, the history of labor organizing in coal mining is also a story of remarkable courage and determination. Individual miners risked everything to challenge a system that treated them as expendable resources. They organized in secret, endured persecution, and maintained their commitment to improving conditions for their fellow workers, even when the personal costs were enormous. The eventual success of miners' unions in achieving improved wages, better working conditions, and greater safety protections demonstrated that corporate power, however overwhelming it might seem, was not absolute. But this success came at an enormous cost in human suffering and required decades of struggle by workers who were fighting against overwhelming odds with minimal resources and limited support from the broader society. The story of labor organizing in coal mining communities is a reminder that the basic rights and protections for granted today were not gifts from benevolent employers, but were won through the struggles of people who were willing to sacrifice their security and safety for the possibility of a better life for themselves and their families. It is also a reminder of how completely corporate power can dominate communities and individuals when there are no effective checks on that power and no alternative sources of economic opportunity. While miners were dying underground in explosions, cave-ins, and the slow suffocation of black lung disease, the wider world went about its business with the serene indifference of people whose comfortable lives depended on not thinking too deeply about where their coal came from or what it cost to extract it. The coal that heated their homes, powered their factories, and fueled their prosperity emerged from the earth as clean and anonymous, as if it had been manufactured in some pleasant, ventilated facility by workers who went home each evening to wholesome dinners and peaceful sleep. The geographic isolation of mining communities was both a practical necessity and a convenient arrangement for everyone who benefited from coal production, but preferred not to witness its human costs. Mines were located near coal deposits, which were usually in remote mountainous or rural areas far from the cities where coal was consumed and the profits were enjoyed. This meant that the people who made policy decisions about mining regulation, who invested in mining companies, and who used coal-powered energy lived in comfortable separation from the people who actually dug the coal out of the ground. The physical distance between coal producers and coal consumers created a psychological distance that made it easy to ignore the human cost of coal production. City dwellers who enjoyed the benefits of coal, heated homes and coal-powered factories could maintain the pleasant fiction that coal was simply a natural resource that was extracted through some vaguely industrial process that didn't involve significant human suffering. The coal arrived in their cities as a clean, processed commodity with no obvious connection to the dangerous, dirty, and often deadly work that had produced it. The news media of the 19th century reflected and reinforced this indifference through its coverage, or more accurately, its lack of coverage, of mining conditions and mining disasters. Newspapers in major cities might report on large mining explosions or particularly dramatic accidents. But these stories were typically brief, focused on the number of casualties rather than the conditions that had caused the accidents, and presented as unfortunate but inevitable consequences of an inherently dangerous industry. The business press was even more removed from the human reality of coal mining. Financial newspapers and magazines covered mining companies as investment opportunities, analyzing their production capacity, profit margins, and stock performance without any reference to the working conditions in their mines or the health and safety of their employees. Mining company executives were profiled as successful businessmen and industrial pioneers, with no mention of the fact that their success was built on the systematic exploitation and often the literal destruction of their workforce. The political establishment was equally indifferent to mining conditions, partly because miners had little political power, and partly because mining companies had enormous political influence. Miners, when they were allowed to vote at all, were often intimidated into supporting candidates favored by their employers. Even when they could vote freely, their numbers were small compared to urban populations, and their geographic isolation made it difficult for them to organize effective political movements. Mining companies, on the other hand, were major sources of campaign contributions, tax revenue, and economic development in many states. Politicians who might have been sympathetic to miners' concerns were often reluctant to antagonize powerful corporate interests that could influence their political careers and their state's economic prosperity. The result was that mining regulation, when it existed at all, was minimal and largely ineffective. The academic and intellectual communities of the 19th century showed little interest in studying or documenting the conditions in mining communities. Universities and research institutions were often dependent on donations from wealthy industrialists, including mining company owners, which made it unlikely that they would sponsor research that might be critical of industrial practices. The few academics who did study mining conditions often approached the subject from the perspective of industrial efficiency rather than worker welfare, focusing on ways to increase production and reduce costs rather than on ways to improve working conditions or protect miners' health. The medical establishment was equally indifferent to the health problems of coal miners. While doctors in major cities were developing sophisticated treatments for the diseases of the wealthy, they showed little interest in the occupational illnesses that were endemic in mining communities. Medical schools didn't teach about black lung disease, and medical journals rarely published articles about the health effects of coal dust exposure. When mining-related health problems were discussed at all, they were typically attributed to miners' lifestyle choices rather than to their working conditions. The religious institutions of the time, despite their professed concern for the poor and suffering, generally ignored the plight of coal miners and their families. Urban churches focused on the moral improvement of city dwellers and showed little interest in the industrial conditions that created widespread suffering in rural communities. Even when religious leaders did speak out about industrial conditions, they typically advocated for individual charity and moral reform rather than for structural changes that might address the root causes of miners' problems. The labor movement in other industries was often unsympathetic to miners' struggles, viewing mining as a backward and primitive form of work that was fundamentally different from the more civilized forms of industrial labor. Skilled craftsmen and factory workers who were organizing their own unions sometimes looked down on miners as unskilled laborers whose problems were the result of their own failure to develop marketable skills or to organize effective labor movements. This attitude reflected a broader social hierarchy that ranked different types of work according to their perceived skill level, cleanliness, and respectability. Mining was viewed as dirty, dangerous, and requiring little skill, which made it easy for other workers to dismiss miners' problems as the natural consequences of choosing an inferior form of employment. The fact that many miners had little choice in their employment, and that mining actually required considerable skill, experience, and physical capability was ignored in favor of stereotypes that justified indifference to miners' working conditions. The women's rights movement of the 19th century also showed little interest in the problems facing women in mining communities. Middle-class women who were fighting for political rights and educational opportunities had little connection to the wives and daughters of coal miners, who faced fundamentally different challenges and had fundamentally different needs. The women's rights movement focused primarily on issues that were relevant to educated, middle-class women rather than on the broader problems of economic exploitation and industrial working conditions that affected working-class women. The emerging conservation movement was primarily concerned with preserving natural beauty and wildlife habitat rather than with protecting the communities that were affected by resource extraction industries. Conservationists who advocated for the protection of forests and wilderness areas showed little interest in the environmental devastation caused by coal mining or in the human communities that were destroyed by mining operations. This selective environmental concern reflected the class interests and aesthetic values of the conservation movement supporters, who were typically wealthy urbanites who valued natural beauty as a recreational resource rather than as the foundation of rural communities' economic survival. The idea that environmental protection should include protection of working-class communities from industrial pollution and environmental degradation was not widely accepted among early conservationists. The charitable institutions and social reform movements of the 19th century were focused primarily on urban problems and urban populations. Settlement houses, charity organizations, and social reform groups worked to address the problems of city slums, factory working conditions, and urban poverty. but they showed little interest in the rural poverty and industrial exploitation that characterized mining communities. This urban focus was partly practical. Charitable organizations were located in cities, but had better access to urban populations than to remote rural communities. But it also reflected the social and cultural bias of middle-class reformers who were more comfortable addressing problems that were familiar to them than problems that existed in communities they didn't understand and rarely visited. The international perspective on American mining conditions was equally indifferent. European observers who were critical of American industrial practices generally focused on factory conditions and urban poverty, rather than on mining communities. Even socialist and labor movement publications from Europe, which were highly critical of capitalist exploitation, paid relatively little attention to the specific problems of American coal miners. This international indifference was partly due to the fact that European countries had their own mining industries with their own problems, but it also reflected the general assumption that dangerous and unhealthy working conditions were simply inevitable aspects of industrial development that all societies would have to endure as they modernized their economies. The cultural productions of the 19th century, literature, art, music, and popular entertainment, rarely addressed mining conditions or mining communities in any realistic way. When miners appeared in novels or plays, they were typically portrayed as noble but simple working men whose problems were the result of fate or bad luck rather than systematic exploitation. The brutal realities of mining life were sanitized and romanticized in ways that made them acceptable to middle-class audiences without challenging anyone to think seriously about the structural problems that created such conditions. This cultural indifference was both a cause and a consequence of the broader social indifference to mining conditions. Writers, artists, and entertainers who depended on middle-class audiences for their livelihood were unlikely to produce works that made those audiences uncomfortable by forcing them to confront the human costs of their comfortable lifestyles. At the same time, the absence of realistic portrayals of mining life in popular culture made it easier for the general public to remain ignorant of conditions in mining communities. The technological and scientific communities were interested in mining primarily as an engineering challenge rather than as a social problem. Engineers worked to develop more efficient methods of coal extraction and transportation, but they showed little interest in developing technologies that might improve working conditions or protect miners' health. The assumption was that technological progress would automatically lead to improved conditions, without any need for specific attention to worker welfare or safety. This technological optimism was characteristic of 19th century thinking about industrial development, but it ignored the fact that technological improvements were typically implemented in ways that maximized profits rather than in ways that improved working conditions. New mining technologies often made mining operations more efficient and profitable, while making working conditions more dangerous and unhealthy for the miners who operated them. The economic theories that dominated 19th century thinking about industrial development provided intellectual justification for indifference to mining conditions. Classical economists argued that market forces would automatically produce optimal outcomes for all participants in the economy, including workers. According to this theory, if mining conditions were truly unacceptable, workers would seek employment elsewhere, forcing mining companies to improve conditions in order to attract and retain workers. This theoretical framework ignored the reality that miners had limited employment alternatives and were often trapped in mining communities by debt, geographic isolation, and lack of marketable skills for other types of work. It also ignored the fact that information about working conditions was often suppressed or distorted by companies that had every incentive to minimize public awareness of the problems in their operations. The combination of geographic isolation, political powerlessness, economic dependence, and cultural indifference created a situation in which mining communities existed in a parallel universe that rarely intersected with the concerns or consciousness of the broader society. Miners and their families lived, worked, and died in conditions that would have been considered intolerable if they had been widely known and understood. But their isolation ensured that their suffering remained invisible to the people who might have had the power and influence to address it. This indifference was not simply a passive lack of interest. It was an active avoidance of information, an awareness that might have created moral obligations to act. The comfortable classes of 19th century America had access to information about mining conditions, but they chose not to seek out such information and to ignore it when it was presented to them. This willful ignorance was a necessary component of a system that depended on the systematic exploitation of one group of people for the benefit of another. The tragedy of this indifference was not just that it allowed terrible conditions to persist in mining communities, but that it represented a fundamental failure of social solidarity and moral imagination. The people who benefited from coal production were capable of empathy and moral concern. They demonstrated these qualities in their responses to other social problems and in their treatment of people within their own social circles. But they were unwilling to extend these qualities to people whose the suffering was the foundation of their own prosperity. This selective empathy was a crucial component of the industrial system that created and maintained mining communities. It allowed the benefits of industrial development to be concentrated among the wealthy and middle classes, while the costs